Every January the 2nd, the church celebrates the feast of Saints Basil and Gregory. Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus. We've talked about them before in our course on church history. If you remember back to the third class of our course in church history, these are two saints who lived at the end of the 3rd century and beginning of the 4th century, back at the time of the Council of Nicaea. Basil and Gregory, whom we celebrate today and every January the 2nd, are two of the 3 Cappadocian fathers. So we often refer to them as that. It was St. Basil of Caesarea and his brother, Gregory of Nyssa, and it was Basil's friend, Gregory of Nazianzus as well. So the two that we celebrate today of those 3 Cappadocian fathers are Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus. It's actually interesting because a feminist rereading of this feast includes the older sister of Basil and Gregory of Nyssa. Their older sister was Macrina. And had it not been for Macrina, we probably wouldn't have these great saints in the church today. Why not? Because Macrina was the one who pointed out to her brother Basil how vain and proud he was becoming by all of the knowledge that he was accumulating. So he was going to school and learning a lot and thinking that he was better than others, and it was Macrina who pointed that out to him, and also who helped to teach him the ways of the desert ascetics. Another important event in Basil's life was the death of his brother Naucratius. And so when his brother Naucratius died, it simply got Basil thinking about what's important in life, and suddenly this accumulation of knowledge and or riches seemed to pale in comparison. And so we credit their sister Macrina for helping him to learn about the ways of the faith and about spirituality. After living as a monk then for 6 years, Basil was ordained, interestingly, against his will. Didn't want to be a priest, but was ordained for the church, went to Caesarea, which is why we call him Basil of Caesarea, and was there that he was assisting the bishop in the struggle against Arianism. We remember from our study in church history and Christology, Arianism was the heresy that Christ was the firstborn of all creatures, so that Christ is not God in the same way that God is God, that Christ is subordinate to God the Father, that Christ was a creature like us. And so Basil of Caesarea went to Caesarea to assist the bishop in the struggle there. And it was an interesting time in Caesarea because there was no harvest that year, which simply meant that many people were hungry, and Basil saw the situation and decided it was time to do something. And so in his preaching and in his works, we find him helping those in need. For instance, he founded a village outside the city, which they refer to as the New City. These two saints that we celebrate today, Basil and Gregory, they founded the New City outside the walls of Caesarea, where they had a place where they could feed the hungry and take care of the sick and to give employment to the unemployed, a way that they were living the corporal works of mercy. Basil wrote at that time some very interesting words. He said, "If anyone takes the clothing off another person, then that person is a thief. Why give any other name to one who can clothe the naked, but refuses to do so?" He said, "The bread that you withhold from the poor belongs to them. The shoes rotting in your closet belong to those who don't have shoes." So think for a moment about this charge that Basil was making about those who had things that they weren't sharing with the poor. Essentially, if you have shoes in your closet that you are not wearing, you are a thief. Why? Because, said St. Basil, those shoes belong to the poor. If you have more food than you need, then that food belongs to the poor, and by keeping it from them, you are a thief. Some strong words from Basil of Caesarea, whom we celebrate this day on January the 2nd and every January the 2nd. Basil would eventually become the bishop of Caesarea. When the bishop of Caesarea died, he was elected bishop, and then interestingly, when the story that we have of St. Basil is that when the emperor was coming to town And the emperor, Valens, was one who espoused Arianism, this heresy that Basil and his contemporaries were trying to battle. And so when this Arian emperor, Valens, was coming to town, everyone was preparing for his visit, and Basil was not preparing to welcome the emperor in the same way. And so they threatened Basil that he better get in shape for the emperor's visit. And Basil responded to them, "All that I have that you can confiscate are these rags that I'm wearing and a few books. Nor can you exile me, for wherever you send me, I shall be God's guest. As to torture, you should know that my body is already dead in Christ, and death would be a great boon to me, leading me sooner to God." So essentially, what we have is a story of this man who stood up bravely against those who were coming and telling him that he had to bow before the emperor, this Arian emperor Valens, and how it was that he was not willing to make those concessions. And so when people said that they had never met a bishop like Basil, his response was, "Perhaps that is because you have never met a true bishop." How it is that Basil gives this example of one who is willing to stand for his or her faith. And then his friend, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory was the son of the bishop of Nazianzus. He was the son of a bishop. Gregory of Nazianzus was a son of a bishop, which means what for us? It means that in that time, we know that bishops were married, and that bishops obviously had children if Gregory was the son of the bishop of Nazianzus. Remember that for nearly half of the church's history, we had a married clergy in the church, which is why we in the American Catholic Church in the United States have no problem at all with the married clergy. It's part of our tradition. It's part of who we are. And so we see how it is that St. Gregory, whom we celebrate today, was the son of a bishop, the bishop of Nazianzus. After 14 years in Athens, Gregory returned home and he joined Basil in living monastic life. The two of them founded a men's community. Gregory, like his friend Basil, was ordained against his will, but then he returned to Basil's community, and after Basil became the bishop of Caesarea, he named Gregory the bishop of a small hamlet, which interestingly strained their relationship. Did Gregory want to be a bishop? Gregory did not want to be a bishop. He was happy living the monastic life when he was living, but Basil ordained or consecrated him a bishop. Interestingly, because Gregory took a leading role against Arianism after Basil's death. And so once Basil died, Gregory really stepped up and helped to lead in the fight against Arianism. The people of Constantinople elected him bishop and patriarch. And so when the emperor, Theodosius, later convened the Council of Constantinople, the patriarch of Constantinople, Gregory of Nazianzus, led that gathering. So, in the year 381, when the Council of Constantinople convened, it was the Patriarch of Constantinople who presided over that, and that Patriarch was Gregory of Nazianzus, whom we celebrate today. It was at that council that we reaffirmed Nicaea, clarifying the difference between ousia and hypostasis, for those of us who remember our course in Christology. And so how it is that we came up with this compromise. We're talking about how it is that Jesus is truly God, but also the Arian position was that Jesus was this crucified criminal. And so we came up with this new, very high Christology of seeing Christ as what we call the Pantocrator, how it is that Christ is divine and exalted. It was our way of battling Arianism, showing how it is that Jesus was not like the rest of us human beings, that Jesus was truly God. And so we started having these images of Christ as this all-powerful being over all of creation. We called it the Pantocrator, an image of Jesus sitting on a throne and ruling over the entire world. So by the end of the 4th century, we went from this crucified carpenter and criminal, Jesus of Nazareth, to now this Lord over all the universe, this image of Jesus, the Pantocrator. and it's the Council of Constantinople that we have to thank for that. And over that council, we had Gregory of Nazianzus presiding, whom we celebrate today. So the two great saints that we celebrate today are Saints Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus. Very interesting examples and models for us as a church, and very important figures in the time in which they lived.